Okay, welcome back for part two. And this time we'll talk about we'll extend on the interview and the types of stories, and we'll talk about the sources and how to treat off the record interviews and when somebody tells you they want to review their story. So it's quite a variety of things that I've said that we'll talk about. So we'll try to hit all of those. Okay, so what happens when you go through an extensive interview and you think, wow, I have it, it's in the barrel, and then something happens that's unexpected? Well, back in the 90s, I had interviewed a gentleman for the final piece of a puzzle in a story about stock in a retirement company that had been, the directors of the company had decided that the company should not invest itself in Disney stock. This was back when it was controversial. Um, this would have been before your all's time, as far as adults, for most of you. But when Disney, uh, gay, lesbian days at Disney were quite controversial, and this was a very conservative company, a retirement company that was supposed to be screening companies that they invested in. So the trustees found out that investors had picked back up, managers had picked back up Disney stock, and so they were feuding and fighting mad about this. So I interviewed a couple of the trustees, and they disclosed to me that indeed this had been controversial, and they had directed the managers to divest themselves of Disney, or divest the company of Disney stock. So I think the headline to the story was something like annuity board fumbles Disney stock, something like that. Okay, so I had the interview in the bag. I had a plan of action, and I was pretty much ready to go. And then at the end of the interview, the gentleman that I was talking to said, "Well, you are going to let me read this story before it's published, correct?" And I said, "No, that's not our process. I neither have time nor the inclination to let you read what others say before the story is published." Um, Especially when you're writing about a controversial topic, it's considered typically almost unethical to let well, it is unethical to let the reader, the person that you've interviewed, read what others say before the story is published. In other words, that person that you've interviewed really shouldn't be given a heads up about what the other persons or people or persons in the stories have said before that story is published. They may want to badger the other people for disagreeing with them before the story is even published, which would then create a position of that other person calling you up and saying, well, maybe I want to change some of the things I said. It just creates a whole firestorm of things. The most important thing, however, I want to stress to you as a writer, and this may be something your book agrees or disagrees with, because I noticed it said that, people do this, as a matter of fact, especially in feature stories. It depends on the type of story, and it depends on who the person is. In a controversial story, especially with a high-placed individual, if you have your tape, if you're clearly on tape, if the person has given you permission, my response back to that person was, I am credible. You knew that when you agreed to give me the interview. If you had any misgivings about how I would treat this information, you should not have talked to me on the record. My practice is to not share the story with you before it's published. If you are uncomfortable with that, I will not use your interview at all. Now, that is a very hard stand to take. That puts the responsibility back on me to now have to figure out What am I going to do? Now, you can be, depending on the story, especially, you can be friendly. You can try to get that person to agree. Absolutely. I have done that just this past year in trying to help a person to understand that what they said is hugely important. But typically, it's not a person that's trying to ask to read a story. It's trying to get a person to go on the record in the first place with what they're talking about, and then maybe bargaining with them afterwards because, oh my goodness, they realize they've said a whole lot and now they want to maybe pull back a little bit. That's different. This is a person who has come to the end of the interview and now says, before you've even had a chance to write the story, I'm going to want to read the story. Number one, it might inhibit how you write your story if you think that person's going to read it. It might or might not. You should be conscientious of how that person is going to perceive it when you write the story. That's just ethical. You're supposed to minimize harm, whether it's a news story, whether it's a feature story. You should be cognizant. You should be making sure your facts are correct. If you tell that person, I'm going to let you read it because I want you to make sure that it's correct, how credible do you sound at that moment? I want you to read it to make sure that I got it right. I want you to double check me. How confident should I be in you if you say that? Not very. In other words, if you are not confident yourself of your own competence, then you've got a bigger problem. Number one, that's why you tape. Number two, that's why you ask questions. Number three, that's why you ask follow-up questions later if you have any inkling that you don't understand what they said. There's no reason to not go back and ask. That's what you can assure that person with that asks you to read the story. You can say, oh, well, I'm sorry, Nancy. If I have a question about anything, I'll be happy to get back with you. Typically, that takes care of it. If Nancy insists that she read the story before it goes to publication, because after all, she is an English teacher, that's the time to say, I understand that, but you agreed to this interview. I'm the journalist, and so I would hope that you have enough confidence in me to let me go forward with this. She should understand at that point that you are the journalist and that you have a vested interest in making sure that that story is a good story because your name is on it. In my case, I did pull that interview. And then I did what I'm hoping that a number of you, the majority of you, all of you at some point in your life will do. I got down on my knees and I prayed. I prayed very hard. That was an incredibly important story that I had promised to my editor that very next morning. It was 9 o'clock at night on the East Coast. It was 7 o'clock at night in Missouri. I remember standing there and then kneeling on the floor in front of my washing machine at home. That's a freelance writer for you, okay? And thinking, Lord, Lord, what did I do? I need to get this story turned in. They're waiting on this story. They've already extended my deadline. Oh my goodness, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? And then I went outside. I kind of walked around the block, which we lived on a seminary campus at the time, so it wasn't a very big block. Went back in, and I remembered at that time, oh my goodness, there's another guy whose name I had written down on a red file folder who was an actual accountant. He wasn't a pastor like this person that I had talked to that was on the board of directors for this retirement company, but he was actually an accountant. He was in finance. So if anything, he might be even more willing to share his point of view on this. Do you know that when I called him, he gave me the best interview, the most solid information. He was outspoken. Oh my goodness. I was so thankful. I'm like, there by the grace of God go I. God answered my prayer. My story was salvaged. My story was better. And I had not compromised my ethics, my position. Some people might think that that's prideful, but when you've been a writer for a long while, people need to trust you. When you've been a writer for a short while, people need to learn to trust you. If you get things right, you'll find people saying to you, "Wow, you got everything right. You spelled my name right. You spelled the name of the city right. You quoted me." I think the best compliments I ever get is, "You didn't distort what I said. You quoted me accurately." When I covered the Terry Schiavo case here in Florida, the attorneys were on both sides. Uh, You got every fact of the case right. That is high praise, but it does not come without work. And that leads me to my next um, talk here. Whether it's a feature article, sometimes people think, oh, feature, editorial, first person. Um, I'm just writing off the top of my head. I'm remembering, when I was small, we traveled to here, we traveled to there. Oh, I don't really remember the population of that city. I'll just leave it that. Even those kinds of articles require research. Research. Details are what make good feature stories. Details, descriptions, a lot of work. Some of the best feature stories that I've ever written have required an enormous amount of time in doing the background research that shows up. There's a group of stories that I wrote based in Kurdistan, Iraq. I went to cover some educational conferences, which are really pastors' conferences. Just before the American military pulled out of Kurdistan, Iraq, we were actually in Dahuk, which is one of the areas that's in Erbil, which is one of the areas that's very much on the news and has been for the past few years, right outside of Mosul, about 30 minutes from Mosul, where all of the fighting is going on right now to try to take back the city. When I was there were people that were already fleeing from Mosul. I had interviewed several people from that area. Well, in one of the stories that I wrote was one of the short feature stories. We talk about short and long. Even in this short feature story that's no more than 500 words, maybe 6, this is a story that I won an award for. The headline is Iraqi Pastor. Imagine if I had mistreated him. Well, I had this interview with an Iraqi pastor who was this blonde, well, not blonde, gray, white-haired man. And I'm going to put a link to this in the email and in the description so that you can read the story yourself. He took on the flavor of one of these Arabian Nights when he was telling me this story, fascinating story of having met the governor of Kurdistan, Iraq, years and years before when he employed him to work on a dam in the area. Years later, he goes to this same man, not knowing who he was, who had become the governor of Iraq, asking him for land to build a church and a school and a seminary and so forth, which is what I was over there partially for, also to cover this transfer of land and laying of a cornerstone. So he tells that story of how he ran into him years later. And the headline was, Imagine if I had mistreated him. So he's talking about him being a Christian who had treated a Muslim when he was young well. And here now the table had turned, and here the man who had been a young Muslim man sitting on the side of the road had become the deputy governor, not the deputy governor, but the governor of Kurdistan, Iraq. And he was standing in front of him. And his thought was, imagine if I had mistreated him. They worked for him. Hamo is his last name. Farouk Hamo. They worked for him for 107 days. So it's kind of a tale of the Arabian Nights style. And I won an award for that. But more so, some of the things I wanted to point out to you in this story was, number one, I did this interview as we were leaving Iraq on the back of a bus. He had had a story that he wanted to tell me the whole time, but he was very busy. He was very busy. He was very busy. I finally tracked him down and said, "Oh, but Brother Hamo, please tell me the story you've been dying to tell me." And so literally the bus was running. People were like waiting around, and he's telling me this story on the back of the bus. He needed to leave the bus. We were leaving. And I'm like, just give me a few more minutes. Just give me a few more minutes. I'm telling people because I wanted to hear this story. And so I'm recording this story into my tape recorder at that point, listening to this fascinating story. And then it wouldn't be until weeks later, well, probably 2 weeks later, after I get back to Florida, that I'm actually listening to all this and realizing how much work I would have to do to figure out some of this, where exactly it was, where the dam was, what it was called, what the governor's name was, how it was spelled, Tamar Ramadan, how many people lived in the Dahuk area. Um, when Ramahan was first elected, I had to search this all out using Google, using anything I could get, because he didn't give me all that information. He didn't tell me when that man was first elected. He didn't tell me what the population of the area was at the time. He didn't even tell me anything about his advanced degrees or anything. I had to go back and forth with him later on Facebook to find that out because he remained in Baghdad. I mean, he was from Baghdad, so he left from Dahuk and went to Baghdad, and we left and went to actually to Jordan for 8 days and then back to the United States. So all of that took an enormous amount of work for that little 500-word story, but it was a significant story. And I actually won an award for it. I love the story, whether I won an award for it or not. There was another story that I wrote that I'm going to put a link in there that's a long story. Those were both in a package of stories, but the long story actually gave context to this shorter story. The headline here is "In Iraqi Kurdistan, Baptist Partner for Clinic, School." This actually gives the context of everything that was happening. How it is a feature story, it's more of a news feature because there is a time and place in history, but it's a feature story because there's so much description. Samil on the main road of an agricultural plain about 100 miles from the Turkish border. So we're giving the whole news event context. Where is this place? It has a tragic history for Assyrian Christians. In 1800s, its Christian inhabitants were forced from their homes. Does this sound familiar? Interesting, huh? Do you realize that all of this happened before the Yazidis and the Christians, before it was reported that they were forced from their homes? Interesting, huh? Except that when we went in 2012, just before the American military pullout, we anticipated that this was going to happen again as a result of the American military pullout, because what I'm talking about here was when the Brits pulled out in 1933, when the Brits pulled out, and before that in 1800, when 1,000 people had been massacred there. 3,000 people had been massacred on that very spot. It's a little confusing, but read it in the story, and you're going to be fascinated by the repeat of history in that same place where I happen to be. So those are the kind of details, though, that made that into a feature rather than just a straight news story. A straight news story would have been, hey, we were installing a cornerstone there, with the deputy governor of Kurdistan, Iraq, whose hand I shook. Interesting story there. There was a group of pastors from the United States who traveled there, and Brian Barlow was among them. He's a mission pastor from Florida. That's a straight news story. This other information about the dream, cementing the dream that they had for this land, that's all feature. That's all additional information, details, colorful things added to it. It starts out, here's my lead. A new day dawned in Iraqi Kurdistan this fall as Governor Tamar Ramadan gave Baptists 2 acres of land valued at $2 million for the Grace Baptist Cultural Center, a multi-phase project including a medical clinic, school, athletic facility, church building, and seminary in the town of Samil. Okay, So a new day dawned. You wouldn't necessarily put that in a news story. It is a feature lead. And then it plays out in about 4 or 5 paragraphs at the gathering of 100 people under a banner bearing a colorful map of Iraq's regions marked with a cross and open hands. That's a detail you wouldn't put into a news story, not a straight news story, not a hard news story. That is definitely either a news feature, some people would call it, or a feature story for a newspaper. Feature story for a magazine might put even more detail, although there are magazines that cross over. Time magazine, for instance, we call it Time magazine, but it's a news magazine. We put news stories in Time magazine. So there's a lot of magazine and newspaper crossover when it comes to news feature stories. Okay, so we're already at 20 minutes, and I spent a lot of time on that. And I really only wanted to mention one more thing. On styling your stories, don't ever feel obligated to go chronological. That's what I was talking about a little bit ago. When you reflect and you look back over your information, your interview, I remember, excuse me for scratching my face there, an interview I did with Tony Dungy out on the ball field or the stadium. Can't think of the name of the stadium. It's in Tampa. Anyway, it's the stadium where the Super Bowl was played in Tampa. Anyway, I was doing an interview with Tony Dungy, and I was trying to think of how to write that story up. It was for a special front page of a news magazine. I kept thinking how, he's involved with this dad's ministry group thing, and how do I talk about Tony Dungy and his ministry? And I literally started mopping my kitchen floor. I was mopping my kitchen floor. It's like my best thinking time, shower time, mopping time, cleaning time. I'm trying to think how, I'm going over that, and I'm like, oh, he's like a modern day John the Baptist bringing the message. Well, some people were, oh, John the Baptist. I mean, we shouldn't be comparing godly, And I'm like, no, but he is. He's a modern day John the Baptist. He's bringing the message to men, okay, of the Savior. So why not? So I think that's the way I sort of started the story out with, Tony Dungy, great Super Bowl winning coach of the Indianapolis Colts, as a modern day John the Baptist. But oftentimes it takes reflection, it takes time, it takes carefully looking at your interview and then dreaming, thinking about significant. I always say you reach in and you pull out something significant, something catchy, something heart-rendering, and you pull that to the top, and then you just kind of craft from there. You put a puzzle together. You don't just go chronological as to how you asked the questions and how the answers came out, and you pick a little from here and a little from there. I used to think that was wrong. I used to think that was, if you go to an event even, that it was up to you to say this happened and then and then and then and then. No, you are not hurting, you're not breaking integrity, you're not hurting credibility by taking things out of sequence and putting them in order of importance or in order of interest. Now, whose importance? Well, yes, it's subjective. Well, that's the power of a reporter. That's the power of a writer. But that's also, it is your responsibility, because you are looking at the big picture. You're looking at the forest, not the trees, and you're helping your reader. You're assisting them. You're crafting the story in such a way that they can move through that story. You're crafting, you're moving them through that story. So that's what I want you to think about, is how you're moving them through that story, and how can you best move them through that story. You can also remember, please, 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 do it with short paragraphs. You do not open a magazine. You do not look at a website and look at a web page and see huge, long paragraphs. If you do, you're not likely to read it very long. You're not likely to stay there very long. I'm looking back at the stories that I'm talking to you about, and they're short paragraphs. I mean, you have most paragraphs are under 50 words, some are under 25. You just keep it moving. There should never be a paragraph with more than one quote in it. I mean, if you have more than one quote in a paragraph, you need to look for a way to break it. Break it, break it, break it, break it. I always tell people you really can't break it too many times. It's not the rules of English that apply here. You're not writing an essay. You're writing a news article. This is not an essay. It's a news article. So break it up, break it up, break it up, because your eyes are wanting to follow along, follow along, follow along. That's how you're moving somebody through your article. So please, by all means, break it up. Keep it moving. Break it up. Keep it moving. Save your essays, your 5-part essays, for your literature class. You're going to write a 5-part essay on the importance of tree excavation in Malawi. I don't know. But save that 5-part essay for literature. This is magazine writing, feature writing, news writing, whatever it is. You are writing articles. You are breaking it up. You are small paragraphs. Now, I know that your book says you can go a little bit longer in magazine writing. Sometimes, yes, because you've got a full page and they'll have the column go across the whole page, but don't get carried away with that. Don't be thinking about that. Just be thinking of natural ways to break up the information, to keep the story moving. Your transitions, this is key. Your transitions in an article are sometimes simply that break to the new paragraph. You're not repeating yourself and then, say it again, and then repeat it. That's essay writing. You do not do that in a magazine article or in a news story. You don't say it again, and then repeat it. That is not your transition. Your transition is a new paragraph, a new paragraph, a new paragraph. Don't make it choppy so that we don't understand what you're saying. I mean, borrow a word, borrow something from the thing that you just said here that relates, make it work, do a transition, okay? Or use a subhead. If it's getting long and you're switching subjects over here, use a subhead. That's the best way to do a longer story, more in-depth story, is to create subheads. Okay, I hope that's been helpful. If you have any questions this week, contact me. I know I went to 30 again. That's an hour of your viewing time. I hope that at least you've moved through it and you've listened to some of it that might be helpful. Blessings as you enter this last week. I'm praying for you. Pray for me, and let me know if you have any difficulties. Again, text me, email me, call me, and I'll be available to you to help you. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.